The courtroom was silent. Not the polite silence of order, not the quiet you hear before a routine verdict. This was different. Heavier. As if the very air inside those walls knew that something was about to happen. Something no one in that room was prepared for. At the center of it all stood a woman who looked like life itself had tried to break her more than once. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white, as though she was holding on to the last piece of courage she had left. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at the attorneys. Her eyes stayed fixed on one man only, Judge Frank Caprio. And Judge Caprio, he didn't move either. His gavel rested on the bench, untouched, his gaze steady but unreadable. A man who had seen every kind of story walk into his courtroom. Fathers begging for second chances, veterans carrying secrets, children speaking truths that silenced everyone. But this was different. Even he seemed to feel it. What could bring a courtroom filled with strangers to the edge of their seats like this? What truth had come to light that made a judge known for his compassion pause longer than usual before speaking? The attorneys had said their final words. The evidence had been presented. The woman's story, or at least the version everyone thought they knew, was on the record. And yet, behind her quiet eyes, there was clearly more. A weight that hadn't been spoken yet. Friends, before this day was over, we would learn why this woman had nothing left to lose, and how a single decision from Judge Frank Caprio would turn everything around in a way no one saw coming. Because sometimes justice isn't about laws or fines or verdicts written on paper. Sometimes it's about a single moment, one choice, that changes a life forever. And that moment was about to arrive. The courtroom itself looked like any other in the city. Tall windows letting in narrow beams of daylight, polished wooden benches lined up like soldiers, the faint echo of footsteps on marble floors. But on this morning it felt different. Heavier. As if the walls themselves leaned in closer, waiting for what was about to unfold. Judge Frank Caprio sat high above it all, the weight of decades of service in the lines on his face. People across the country knew him, the judge with the firm voice but kind eyes, the man who believed that justice wasn't just about punishment but about people. He had presided over thousands of cases, some heartbreaking, some even humorous, but he treated each one like it mattered. Because to him it always did. He had seen single mothers standing where this woman now stood. He had heard teenagers stammer through mistakes, veterans swallow back tears, parents beg for mercy. But there was something about this case, something about her. Her name was Maria Santos. 42 years old. A mother. A worker. A woman who had spent her life holding things together with hands that were now trembling as though she had finally run out of strength. Maria had walked into the courtroom wearing the same clothes she wore to the diner where she worked double shifts. The faded uniform. The scuffed shoes. Her hair pulled back not out of style but out of practicality, the way people do when life leaves no room for vanity. To the court this was a case about unpaid fines. Missed deadlines. A record that looked careless on paper. But to anyone really watching, this was a woman carrying far more than tickets or fees. There was a tiredness in her eyes that told a longer story, of nights spent in hospital waiting rooms, of rent notices slipped under doors, of dreams quietly put away because reality didn't leave space for them. Judge Caprio studied her face carefully, the way he always did before a decision. Because behind every case file was a human being. And today, behind the neat stack of papers in front of him, was Maria Santos, a woman whose life was about to be laid bare in ways no one in this courtroom would forget. The first attorney rose from his seat, the soft scrape of his chair against the floor echoing louder than expected in the heavy silence. He was young, confident, his suit sharp, his voice smooth. He represented the city, the rules, the unpaid fines, the long list of infractions that, on paper, painted Maria Santos as someone careless with responsibility. Your Honor, he began, facing Judge Frank Caprio, this case is straightforward. Ms. Santos has accumulated multiple unpaid citations over the last 2 years. Parking violations, late fees, missed court dates. The city has been patient, but the record speaks for itself. Responsibility matters. Accountability matters. At some point there have to be consequences. He glanced briefly at Maria, then back at the judge. This isn't about a single mistake. This is about repeated neglect. Repeated neglect. The words hung in the air like a judgment before the verdict even came. But then Maria's attorney, an older man with tired eyes and a suit that had seen better days, stood slowly. He gathered a few crumpled notes but didn't look at them. Instead, he looked straight at Judge Caprio. Your Honor, he said quietly, the city sees numbers on a page. I see a woman who's been fighting battles no one in this courtroom has had to face. He stepped toward the bench, voice gaining strength. Yes, there are unpaid tickets. Yes, there are deadlines she missed. But behind every single one of those dates is a story. A job lost when the factory closed. A husband who left without warning. A son who spent months in the hospital after the accident. A ripple went through the courtroom. The young attorney shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Maria sat perfectly still, eyes on the floor, as if each word spoken about her life added weight to the air pressing down on her shoulders. This isn't neglect, her attorney continued softly. It's survival. It's a woman trying to choose between rent and medical bills, between food on the table and fines she simply couldn't pay. Judge Frank Caprio leaned back slightly, studying Maria the way he always did when the truth began to change shape before him. Because now this was no longer about tickets or deadlines. It was about a woman standing in a courtroom with nothing left, except, maybe, the hope that someone would finally see the whole story. The first witness was a neighbor, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who walked slowly to the stand, clutching her purse in both hands. She looked nervously at Maria before speaking, as if unsure whether she even had the right to tell pieces of this woman's story out loud. "I've lived next door to Maria for 12 years, she began softly, her voice trembling. "I've seen her leave for work before the sun comes up, come home long after it's dark. She never complains. Not once." The attorney asked about the unpaid fines, about whether Maria had ever talked about them. Mrs. Alvarez shook her head. "She doesn't talk about herself much. But I've watched her work 3 jobs sometimes. I've watched her skip meals so her boy could eat. I've watched her come home dead on her feet and still sit with him to help with his schoolwork." Her eyes glisten now. "She gives everything she has, Your Honor. There's nothing careless about her." The young attorney representing the city shifted in his chair, eyes dropping to the table. The next witness was a nurse from St. Mary's Hospital. She carried a clipboard but didn't look at it once. "Her son," the nurse said gently, "was in our pediatric wing for nearly 4 months after the car accident. Broken leg. Internal injuries. It was a miracle he survived." She glanced toward Maria. "She never left his side. Slept in a chair every single night. Went to work every morning and came back to the hospital after her shift. I don't know how she did it." The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen. Then came Maria's employer from the diner, a stocky man with a white apron still tied around his waist. His voice was gruff but carried a quiet respect. "She's the hardest worker I got," he said simply. "Never late. Never complains. Customers love her. And half the time I think she skips her own lunch just so she can send her kid something extra from the kitchen." He paused, clearing his throat roughly. "When the hospital bills started coming, she asked for more shifts. I gave her what I could, but it still wasn't enough." Maria sat motionless, eyes on the floor, as though the story of her own life belonged to someone else. By the time the witnesses stepped down, the courtroom felt heavier, like every word had piled onto a growing mountain of truths no one could ignore. This was no longer about fines on a page. This was about a woman carrying the weight of survival with a kind of dignity that refused to ask for pity, but whose silence had now been broken wide open for everyone to see. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. He had seen hardship before. He had seen loss. But there was something about Maria's story, about the way she bore it without anger or excuses, that made even him pause longer than usual before speaking. And everyone in that room could feel it. Something bigger than a verdict was coming. The courtroom doors creaked again as the final witness stepped forward, a man in a dark suit carrying a thin folder. No one seemed to know who he was until he introduced himself softly as Father Gabriel, the priest from the small neighborhood church Maria sometimes attended. He walked slowly to the stand, nodded politely to Judge Frank Caprio, and then turned his gaze toward Maria with a look of quiet compassion. "Father," Maria's attorney began, "you told me you had something to share with the court. Something about Maria's past." The priest cleared his throat. "Yes," he said gently. "I have known Maria for almost 15 years. She came to our parish after the fire." A murmur ran through the room. "Fire?" Father Gabriel opened the folder and held up a single newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. 15 years ago, there was an apartment building fire on Jefferson Street. 4 families lived there. Maria's family was one of them." The courtroom leaned in. "She lost everything," the priest said quietly. "Clothes, furniture, her parents. They never made it out." Maria stared at the floor, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She was barely 27, the priest continued. She took custody of her younger sister after that. Raised her while working 2 jobs. Paid for her schooling. all while trying to rebuild her own life from nothing. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, as if the weight of what he was hearing didn't belong in a courtroom about unpaid fines. "Why?" Maria's attorney asked softly. "Has she never spoken about this before? Not to the court, not to her employers, not even to neighbors who've known her for years." Father Gabriel looked toward Maria, then back at the judge. "Because she doesn't believe in asking for pity. Because she thinks everyone has burdens and hers are no heavier than anyone else's. She told me once that the fire taught her something, that life doesn't owe us anything. Not even sympathy." The room fell into complete silence. And now it made sense. The quiet dignity. The exhaustion behind her eyes. The woman who worked until her hands ached, who faced every bill, every hardship without complaint. She had been carrying not just hospital debt or unpaid tickets or endless double shifts. She had been carrying the memory of flames that had taken everything, and choosing, every day since, to keep moving forward anyway. Maria Santos rose slowly, as though the weight of every year she had carried pressed against her shoulders. No lawyer prompted her this time. No witness spoke for her. She stood on her own, her trembling hands clasped tightly in front of her, and for the first time since the case began, she lifted her eyes to meet Judge Frank Caprio's. The courtroom was utterly still. Even the attorney seemed to fade into the background as Maria took a hesitant step toward the bench. "Your Honor," she began softly, her voice uneven but steady enough to reach every corner of the room, "I never meant for things to get this far. I know what the city sees on paper. Missed fines. Deadlines I didn't meet. Responsibilities I couldn't keep up with. And they're right. Those things happened. I can't argue with that." She paused, glancing briefly toward the spectators, then back at the judge. "But what they don't see, what no one sees, is what came before all of this." Maria drew a slow, shaky breath. 15 years ago the fire took everything. My parents. The only home I'd ever known. I remember standing outside in the cold with my little sister while the flames ate through the roof, holding her while she cried because we had nowhere to go. I was 27. I didn't even know how to take care of myself, but I promised her I'd take care of her. Her voice cracked just slightly. And I did. I worked 2 jobs. Some nights I didn't sleep at all. But she graduated because I kept that promise. The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratching of the court reporter's pen. Maria swallowed hard. When she finally left for college, I thought maybe life would slow down. Maybe I could finally breathe. She shook her head faintly. But then the accident happened. My son, my little boy, lying in a hospital bed with tubes everywhere. I stayed with him every night. Went to work every morning. Paid what bills I could. But the hospital bills kept coming. The rent notice kept coming. And then the tickets, the fines, the court dates. She paused again, her voice trembling now. I had to choose, Your Honor. Every single day I had to choose between something I could pay and something I couldn't. Rent or food. Heat or medicine. A hospital bill or a parking ticket. And every time I chose my son. I chose the roof over his head. I chose the medicine that kept him alive. A tear slid down her cheek, but her voice grew stronger. So yes, the tickets went unpaid. The fines added up. And now I'm standing here with nothing left. But I would make the same choice again. 1,000 times over. Because my son is alive. And no law in the world could convince me I should have chosen differently. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back at Judge Caprio. I'm not asking for pity. I'm not even asking for mercy. I just wanted you to know why. Why I failed to keep up. Why the deadlines passed while I was working double shifts and sleeping in a hospital chair. Why I'm standing here now with nothing left to give. Maria's voice softened as she spoke the next words, almost like she was confessing something to herself as much as to the court. I promised my parents I would protect my sister. I promised my son I would keep him safe. And somewhere along the way I broke every promise I made to myself. That's why I'm here. She lowered her head slightly, her hands trembling in front of her. That's all I have to say, Your Honor. For a long moment she just stood there, the quiet around her heavy enough to feel like a physical thing. And then she sat down slowly, like someone who had just handed over the last piece of herself for the world to see. The courtroom didn't move, didn't breathe, because everyone in that room knew they had just heard the kind of truth you don't get in courtrooms very often, the kind that strips everything else away until all that's left is a mother, a life, and a choice no one could ever judge the same way again. Judge Frank Caprio sat silently for a long moment after Maria finished speaking. The courtroom remained frozen, as though even the walls were holding their breath. Papers lay untouched on the bench before him, the city's attorney waiting stiffly, Maria's lawyer staring at the floor, and Maria herself sitting motionless, her hands clasped as if bracing for whatever came next. Judge Caprio finally removed his glasses and set them down gently, his eyes fixed on Maria. "Miss Santos," he began, his voice quiet but steady, "this courtroom sees hundreds of cases every year. People with fines, debts, excuses, all of them hoping for leniency. Some deserve it. Some do not. That is the nature of justice." He leaned back slightly, his hands folded. "But every once in a while, a case walks through those doors that isn't about laws or fines or numbers on a page. It's about life. About the impossible choices people have to make when the world gives them no good options at all." The young city attorney cleared his throat as if to speak, but Judge Caprio lifted one hand sharply without looking at him. The silence returned instantly. "I have listened to the witnesses," the judge continued. "I have heard about the fire that took your parents. About the years you spent raising your sister when most people your age were still figuring out their own lives. I have heard about the accident that nearly took your son, and about the nights you slept in a hospital chair so he wouldn't be alone." He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "And I have heard about the fines. The tickets. The deadlines missed while you were keeping promises no one else could see." The courtroom leaned forward as Judge Caprio reached for the stack of paperwork in front of him. The official records, the fines owed, the list of amounts and dates stretching back months. "On paper," he said slowly, "you owe the city a significant amount. But justice," he looked directly at Maria now, "is not only about what is on paper." He set the papers aside and spoke clearly enough for every person in that room to hear. "This court will dismiss all outstanding fines and penalties against you, effective immediately." Gasps swept through the courtroom. Even Maria's attorney looked stunned. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone firm but warm, "this court will be contacting local organizations and charitable foundations to assist with any remaining medical bills for your son. Your story will not end here in this room defined by what you could not pay. It will end with the help you deserve after all you have given." Maria covered her mouth with one trembling hand, her eyes filling with tears. Judge Caprio picked up his gavel. "Case dismissed," he said softly, with the full compassion of this court. The gavel fell once, sharp, final, echoing through the room like the closing of one chapter, and the beginning of another. When the sound of the gavel finally faded, the courtroom remained quiet for a long moment, as though no one wanted to break the spell. Then slowly people began to rise from the benches, some wiping at their eyes, others just shaking their heads in disbelief. It wasn't the kind of verdict anyone had expected when the day began. It wasn't about fines or paperwork anymore. It was about something far deeper. Justice with a human heart behind it. Maria didn't speak right away. She simply sat there, hands covering her face, trying to absorb what had just happened. After months of struggling, after years of holding everything together on her own, the weight she carried had finally been lifted. And it wasn't because of charity or pity. It was because someone had looked at her life, really seen it, and decided her story was worth more than the mistakes written on a page. Friends, maybe that's what makes Judge Frank Caprio different. He reminds us that the law can punish, yes, but it can also heal. That sometimes what people need isn't another blow to carry, but a chance to finally stand back up. Maria walked out of that courtroom with nothing left hanging over her. No fines, no fear, no shame. What she carried instead was a reminder that compassion can change the course of a life in a single moment. And maybe that's the part of the story that matters most. Because for all of us watching, it makes you wonder, how many people around us are fighting battles we can't see? How many lives could change if justice always remembered the human being on the other side of the law? If this story moved you the way it moved everyone in that courtroom, share it. Leave a comment for Maria or for anyone carrying a burden alone. Because sometimes the simple act of remembering someone's struggle is where change begins. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the sound of footsteps fading down the long hallway, Judge Frank Caprio remained seated for a moment longer. He watched Maria leave with her son, their shoulders lighter now than when they had walked in. Another case closed, another life changed. But across town, another case was waiting. A story unlike Maria's, yet carrying the same weight of human lives and choices that can't always be measured by law books or fines. This time it would be a teenage boy standing before Judge Caprio. 17 years old. Accused of vandalism, reckless behavior, a long list of things the city was ready to punish him for. The newspapers had already painted him as a troublemaker, a lost cause, someone the system had failed too many times before. But what no one knew, not the attorneys, not the reporters, not even the people in his own neighborhood, was why he had done it. Because hidden beneath the charges was a reason that would leave the entire courtroom silent once again. A reason that would test not just the law, but the limits of understanding and forgiveness. Friends, if Maria's story touched your heart, wait until you hear what happens when a boy the world had given up on finally tells the truth no one saw coming. Judge Frank Caprio has seen many cases in his lifetime. But this one? This one might change everything.